All right, everybody. So here are the page numbers we're going to be covering from Foner and the subject heading in case you have a different edition. Let's do it. So I wanted to give a brief background on Washington's presidency since the reading jumps right into Hamilton's financial plan. So he served 2 terms. That was an unofficial precedent that he set. There was nothing limiting the presidential terms. But every president until FDR decided to no longer run for a third term in office. It's interesting because Washington actually didn't want to be president, but he was unanimously elected. We could think about how important his role was in the Revolutionary War and one of the prominent constitutional roles of the president to be the commander in chief of the military. Washington really wanted to deliberately downplay his authority. He wanted to contrast himself from a king, so he dressed less formally. He went by the title Mr. President instead of something like His Highness. He also refused veto power without seeking advice and consent from a newly formed cabinet that he made. So the cabinet, it was not something that was specifically granted by the Constitution, but Washington created it, just a group of advisors. It first was 4 departments. It was the Department of the Treasury, which was headed by Alexander Hamilton, the Department of State, headed by Thomas Jefferson, Department of War, headed by Henry Knox, and the Department of Justice, headed by Edmund Randolph. So the cabinet actually, even though it was part of the executive branch, could be seen as a check on the president's power. And it's also interesting that Washington deliberately chose a bipartisan cabinet. I think the secretary that stands out the most was Thomas Jefferson because he was an anti-federalist before this. He actually had major concerns with the ratification of the Constitution, and yet here he was serving under Washington, who was a federalist, who supported the Constitution. So jumping right into Hamilton's financial plan, right, really emphasizing the role of the Secretary of the Treasury. So one of the biggest problems that Hamilton had to address was the continuing debt left over from the Revolutionary War. It's important to realize that the Treasury was not organized at a federal level yet. States had uneven amounts of debt. And so states that typically saw more action in the war typically owed more. And Hamilton created a financial program to try to resolve this major debt issue, but it was very controversial. So first, he issued a tariff to try to protect American manufacturing. The British were actually flooding the American market with really cheap goods, and the American manufacturing industry was trying to develop and grow, but it couldn't compete with the low British prices, so that tariff was able to help protect American domestic manufacturing. That was less controversial. And then the more controversial part was he was trying to develop a plan to get the federal government to take over all the state debts, to consolidate them, if you will. So most southern states were the ones who objected to this. They had already largely paid their share of the debt, and they didn't want to pay the debt of states like Massachusetts. All right, but ultimately they reached a compromise here. So a Bank of the United States was created, and it was created to handle the debt at the national level. And the trade-off was that the capital of the United States was moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. And you can see that even though it's pretty far up there, it was much more of a central location. So that helped appease the South, who really were opposed to this bank. And again, the purpose of the bank was to assume the nation's finances in a more centralized location. And Hamilton justified it by using something called the Necessary and Proper Clause of the Constitution, also known as the Elastic Clause. And that provided for a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Basically, it meant that if there were new issues that arise, that the Constitution could derive some new powers that were necessary and proper to address those issues. This is controversial. There are a lot of people that argue that the Constitution should be interpreted literally, but yet they basically created a new power. And so this sort of strict constructionist and loose constructionist interpretation of the Constitution actually is something that continues to this day. Okay, foreign policy. There were a lot of issues with foreign policy during Washington's administration too. One of the biggest issues was how to react to the French Revolution. Right, so we all know that the French aided the Americans in the Revolutionary War, so one might sort of assume that the Americans would automatically take the side of the French. But actually, the Americans, many of them were actually really frightened by what was going on in France, particularly when the Reign of Terror started. They were kind of scared that that really scary phase of the war was going to spread over to the United States. So, in general, Federalists opposed. So again, you know, they used to be supporters of the Constitution. They're sort of a newly forming party here. Prominent Federalists were people like Hamilton and John Jay. They basically went against France. They wanted to actually support Britain, also for economic reasons, because Britain and the United States really quickly resumed their trading relationship after the Revolutionary War was over. But the Republicans, they were former anti-federalists, people like Jefferson, recognized that A, France was inspired by the American Revolution, and then B, that Americans wouldn't have won their revolution if it weren't for the French alliance, so the Republicans, aka Jeffersonians, tended to side with the French. Washington decided to step in and issue what was called a Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, basically saying we're not going to take a side in the French Revolution. But the Jefferson/Republicans, they opposed this greatly, and they increasingly start to solidify as this opposition group, right, or party that were frightened by Washington's decision here. The relationship with the British was also pretty tense here. The British resumed this practice that had started prior called impressment, right, which is basically where the British Navy, they would kidnap American soldiers at sea and force them to serve in the British Navy. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, John Jay, traveled to London to try to negotiate some sort of arrangement. So the arrangement actually, ironically, did not address this issue of impressment, which eventually is going to become a major cause of the War of 1812. But Britain did agree to abandon some of their outposts in the American West, the Northwest territories like Ohio. They were actually already supposed to have done that by 1783, so they finally solidified that. And in exchange, the Americans agreed to give British preferential treatment in trade. And so, again, that really enrages the Jeffersonians. They, some of them actually take to the streets and burn John Jay in effigy. That they're not literally burning John Jay here. That's a dummy of him, but it was a very symbolic gesture of opposition. And then again, it really strengthened the resolve to create an opposition party. So this new party, the Republicans, sometimes they're actually called the Democratic Republicans. We also just call them the Jeffersonians. This party starts to really grow and strengthen. Republicans in general, they followed Thomas Jefferson, which is why we nicknamed them Jeffersonians, and they also supported a stronger relationship with France, which we already went over. And this treaty, despite the opposition, was ratified anyway in 1795, and Washington basically was able to persuade the ratification of this treaty by the Senate by exerting what was called executive privilege. One thing that was not in the reading, but I think is worth really briefly mentioning, is what's going on in the Northwest Territories, specifically the relationship between Americans and American Indians. So remember the Northwest Ordinance? That was one of the most successful elements of the Articles of Confederation. It provided some sort of framework for settling the Northwest Territories and turning them into states. So basically, the effect of the Northwest Ordinance is that people are starting to move to these areas in increasing numbers, and what they start to do is they start to seize Native American lands without their consent. So the result of this was that Congress passed what was called the Indian Intercourse Act in 1790, and it required that Americans could only obtain land from Native Americans if they actually ratified a treaty with them. So it is an example of foreign relations, right? Native Americans were sort of treated as a sovereign nation if they were enacting a treaty. But the treaty did not stop any violence between Native Americans and white settlers, or it didn't completely prevent it at least. And also, over time, a lot of these treaties are eventually broken when the demand for land grew. And one prominent example of this treaty, and it shows us also that a lot of these treaties were ratified in the favor of the Americans, a battle fought in the Ohio River Valley called the Battle of Foreign Timbers. It resulted with an American victory, and the treaty that was ratified after, the Treaty of Grenville, basically ceded most of the Ohio territories to Americans. So again, we see a lot of these treaties were in the favor of the Americans or in the favor of the victors. Okay, last source of tension during Washington's administration was something called the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. So rural Pennsylvania, and there was actually a fairly prominent whiskey industry there. But one of the other things that the government had to deal with was continued violence between white settlers and Native Americans. Again, it's a rural area, a little bit further west. So the federal government decides to issue a tax on the production of whiskey. And local residents very much oppose this. They argue that the federal government was unfairly taxing them, and they were struggling economically. You could sort of compare that to Shays' Rebellion. Remember that Daniel Shays, one of the reasons why he revolted against the government was because he was in so much debt. But unlike Shays' Rebellion, Washington was able to really easily put down this rebellion. He just sent 13,000 troops into the region and the rebellion was put down. And so that's a really important contrast with Shays' rebellion. It shows us how much stronger the Constitution was in terms of just raising a military than the Articles of Confederation that literally wasn't able to do that. So I just wanted to point out this cartoon. I think it's really interesting. Bottling up the Whiskey Rebellion. You might notice this is Washington standing here. He is holding onto the Constitution. And I mean, you could see like if the bottle is being shaken, that kind of shows us that tension is building up. But Washington just sort of puts a plug on it by sending the military in there to stop it. And he's also dressed up in a military uniform there. So just a really interesting political cartoon to discuss how Washington is using some of his authorities as commander-in-chief to stop this rebellion. So we're actually going to talk about the end of Washington's presidency in our next reading because that's where it's located, but that's a pretty hopefully comprehensive overview of Washington's administration. You can see a lot of tension, a lot of partisanship forming already, a lot of issues with foreign policy. So even though the United States is independent, it is certainly experiencing some growing pains, as you can see here. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.